A woman fell in love with her kidnapper. This is what happened to her mind. Lara is a 28-year-old financial analyst presenting to the emergency department with severe panic attacks, dissociative episodes, and what her sister describes as completely irrational attachment to a man who had held her captive for 183 days. 6 months earlier, Lara had been working late at her downtown office. Security footage would later show her walking to her car in the basement parking structure at 9:47 p.m. A man approached from behind. Within seconds, she was unconscious, a chloroform-soaked cloth pressed against her face. She woke up in a windowless basement room, 8 feet by 10 feet, a mattress, a bucket, a single overhead bulb, and a man, we'll call him Dan, sitting in the corner, watching her. The first 72 hours were what psychiatrists call the acute terror phase. Lara's amygdala, the almond-shaped structure deep in her temporal lobe responsible for processing threat and fear, was in constant activation. Her sympathetic nervous system flooded her body with cortisol and adrenaline, fight or flight, but she could do neither. Dan brought her food. He spoke calmly. He told her he wouldn't hurt her if she behaved. And here's where something unexpected began in Lara's neurobiology. When a threat you cannot escape becomes the same person who provides your only source of safety, food, and human contact, the brain faces a catastrophic contradiction. Let me explain. Stockholm Syndrome, named after a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where hostages defended their captors, isn't actually recognized as a formal psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM-5. But the neurobiological mechanisms behind it are very real, very measurable, and deeply rooted in evolutionary survival. The phenomenon operates on 3 primary neural pathways. First, trauma bonding through intermittent reinforcement. Dan was unpredictable. Sometimes he would bring Lara her favorite foods. Somehow he knew she liked Thai food. Sometimes he would sit and talk to her about philosophy, asking her opinions, treating her like an intellectual equal. Other times, he would leave her alone in the dark for 18 hours straight, with no food, no water, no explanation. This inconsistency, random intervals of kindness amid deprivation, creates one of the most powerful conditioning patterns known to behavioral psychology. It's called a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, and it's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Each small kindness from Dan triggered a dopamine release in Lara's ventral tegmental area. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation and reward. But because these rewards came unpredictably, her brain began to crave them obsessively, scanning constantly for any sign that kindness might come again. By week 3, Lara found herself feeling grateful when Dan brought her a blanket. Grateful to the man who had kidnapped her. Second, cognitive dissonance and identity reformation. Lara's prefrontal cortex, the rational executive function center of her brain, was trying to make sense of an impossible situation. She knew objectively that Dan had committed a serious crime against her, but she was also completely dependent on him for survival. Every meal, every moment of safety, every scrap of human interaction. The human mind cannot tolerate this level of contradiction. So it does something remarkable. It reshapes the narrative to reduce the psychological pain. A 2008 study by Namniak and colleagues published in Acta Psychiatrica Scandinavica examined 75 cases of hostage situations and found that cognitive reframing occurred in approximately 27% of cases, lasting longer than 3 days. The victims began to see their captors not as perpetrators, but as protectors, protecting them from an even worse fate, from other potential threats, even from themselves. By week 7, Dan told Lara about his childhood, abusive father, neglectful mother, a system that failed him. And Lara, isolated, terrified, dependent, began to feel empathy. Her anterior cingulate cortex, involved in empathy processing, activated in response to his stories. She began to see him as a complex human being, not just her captor, a victim himself in his own way. Third, dissociation and identity fragmentation. By month 4, Lara's sense of self began to dissolve. Prolonged captivity creates what psychiatrist Judith Herman calls complex trauma, different from single-event PTSD. When someone is held in sustained captivity, especially with intermittent psychological manipulation, the hippocampus, responsible for contextual memory formation, begins to malfunction under chronic cortisol exposure. Studies using MRI imaging have shown that prolonged stress can actually shrink hippocampal volume by up to 20%. Memory becomes fragmented, sense of time distorts, identity becomes fluid. Lara stopped thinking of herself as Lara, financial analyst with an apartment and a life. She became the woman in the basement. Her entire existence was defined by Dan's presence and approval. When he smiled at her, she felt joy. When he frowned, she felt terror. He had become her entire world, her weather, her seasons, her reason for existing. On day 183, police raided the house. Dan had made a mistake. He'd used Lara's credit card at a gas station, and facial recognition software had flagged him. Within hours, tactical teams surrounded the property. When officers burst into the basement, they expected to find a traumatized woman grateful for rescue. Instead, Lara screamed at them. She physically placed herself between Dan and the officers. She begged them not to hurt him. She told them they didn't understand. As Dan was handcuffed and led away, Lara collapsed, sobbing his name. At the emergency department, Lara presented with acute psychological crisis. Her heart rate was 142 beats per minute. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She oscillated between panic attacks and complete dissociative shutdown, staring blankly, unresponsive to questions for minutes at a time. The psychiatric consult team noted something particularly concerning in their assessment. Lara expressed more distress about Dan's arrest than about her own 6 months of captivity. Dr. Reeves, the attending psychiatrist, recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome as popularized in media. It wasn't romance or true love. It was a complex neurobiological survival response that had fundamentally altered Lara's neural architecture. Let me break down what had happened in Lara's brain over those 183 days. Her amygdala had been chronically hyperactive, creating sustained fear conditioning. But simultaneously, because Dan was her only source of safety, her brain had created what's called a paradoxical attachment, attaching to the very source of threat because he was also the only source of relief from that threat. This is seen in animal models too. Harry Harlow's famous and controversial maternal deprivation experiments in the 1950s showed that infant rhesus monkeys would desperately cling to artificial surrogate mothers even when those surrogates delivered painful electric shocks. The need for attachment, especially under stress, overrides rational threat assessment. In Lara's case, her oxytocin system, typically associated with bonding and trust, had been hijacked. Every moment of relative kindness from Dan released oxytocin, creating a biochemical bond. Oxytocin, from the Greek oxys, meaning quick, and tokos, meaning birth. Quick birth, referring to its role in childbirth and maternal bonding. But it doesn't discriminate. It bonds us to whoever provides care and closeness during vulnerable states. Her prefrontal cortex, meanwhile, had adapted to constant threat by adopting what psychologists call a fawn response, a lesser-known fourth F alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Fawn. Befriend the threat, become valuable to the threat, make yourself indispensable so the threat won't hurt you. Over time, this adaptation had become automatic, unconscious, and felt like genuine emotion. Lara spent 3 weeks in the psychiatric unit. Treatment involved a careful, phased approach. Phase 1. Safety and stabilization. Establishing that she was actually safe now. This sounds simple, but for someone whose entire nervous system had been conditioned to scan for threat constantly, true safety felt alien, even frightening. Phase 2. Psychoeducation. Helping Lara understand what had happened to her brain, that her feelings, however real they felt, were the product of trauma neurobiology, not authentic relationship. Dr. Reeves showed her the research, the brain scans, the animal studies, the documented cases. Knowledge became a kind of cognitive override, her prefrontal cortex slowly regaining authority over her limbic system. Phase 3. Trauma processing using EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. This therapy helps the brain reprocess traumatic memories that have been stored in a fragmented, unintegrated way. The therapy is based on research showing that bilateral stimulation, moving the eyes back and forth, activates both hemispheres of the brain and may facilitate the processing of traumatic memories by mimicking the REM sleep state when the brain naturally processes and integrates experiences. Slowly, over months, Lara's brain began to rewire. But here's what the research tells us. Complete recovery from this type of trauma bonding is rare. A 2018 longitudinal study by Adorian and colleagues followed 43 kidnapping survivors for 5 years. 68% continued to experience intrusive thoughts about their captors. 41% reported residual positive feelings toward their captors even years after release. 18 months after her rescue, Lara sits across from me in a coffee shop. She's returned to work, though she changed firms. She's in therapy twice a week. She has a new apartment with multiple locks and a security system she checks obsessively. She tells me that the hardest part isn't the flashbacks or the hypervigilance. It's the guilt. "I know what he did was wrong," she says, her voice quiet. "Intellectually, I know, but there's still a part of me that wonders if he's okay, if he's being treated well in prison, and I hate myself for wondering that." This is the insidious legacy of trauma bonding. Even when the rational mind has caught up, the emotional brain, the limbic system with its primal survival programming, retains the conditioning. Those neural pathways, carved deep through repetition and terror and intermittent reward, don't disappear. They just become quieter. Lara will live with this dissonance for the rest of her life. The knowledge that her feelings were manufactured by circumstance and neurobiology, but that they nonetheless feel real. That attachment and abuse became neurologically intertwined in a way that's extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Stockholm Syndrome, or by its more clinically accurate name, traumatic bonding, teaches us something profound about human neurobiology. We like to think of our emotions as authentic, arising from our true selves, but emotions are ultimately neural processes shaped by circumstance, chemistry, and conditioning. Under the right conditions, or rather, the wrong conditions, our brains will bond us to anyone, even our captors, even those who hurt us. This has implications far beyond kidnapping cases. Domestic abuse survivors often return to their abusers repeatedly, and bystanders ask, "Why doesn't she just leave?" But the neurobiology of traumatic bonding is identical. Intermittent reinforcement, dependence, identity reformation. The same mechanisms that trapped Lara in that basement trap millions in abusive relationships. Understanding that these feelings are neurobiological, not moral failures, not weakness, not complicity, is crucial for both survivors and those who support them. As for Dan, he was convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to 24 years without parole. During the trial, Lara was required to testify. She did. She told the truth about what he'd done. But when asked if she wanted to make a victim impact statement, she declined. "I don't know what I would say," she told her attorney. "I don't know what I actually feel." The human brain is the most complex structure we know of in the universe. 3 pounds of tissue containing 86 billion neurons, each forming thousands of connections, capable of composing symphonies, proving mathematical theorems, sending spacecraft to distant planets. But this same brain, under the right circumstances, can be convinced to love what harms it, to attach to what should be fled from, to protect what should be feared. Evolution optimized us for survival, not for truth. And sometimes, survival requires telling ourselves stories that aren't true at all. Lara made a full physical recovery. Her psychological recovery continues. She wants others who've experienced similar trauma to know, your feelings don't define your worth. Your neurobiology isn't your fault. And understanding the science doesn't invalidate your experience. It illuminates it. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse or captivity, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. You are not alone. Your brain is doing exactly what brains do under impossible circumstances. That doesn't make it right, but it does make it understandable. Thanks for watching. If you found this video educational, subscribe for more deep dives into the neuroscience of extreme psychological states. Leave a comment with topics you'd like me to cover. And remember, your brain is always trying to protect you, even when its methods seem paradoxical. Until next time.